Chapter 1. The Discovery. Close your eyes for a moment and picture this. The attic of an old Victorian house in Salem, Massachusetts, sealed tight for decades, holding its breath beneath the weight of forgotten years. It is late autumn, the air outside sharp with the scent of drying leaves. Inside, the dust of a century hangs like a soft grey veil, disturbed only by the quiet footsteps of Margaret Chen. Margaret is a professional estate appraiser, the kind of person who spends her days cataloguing the remnants of other people's lives. This house belonged to the Hartwell family, once one of Salem's most respected names. 3 generations of wealth had gathered inside these walls since the home was first built in 1885. Margaret moves carefully across the creaking boards, her tablet in hand, the weak afternoon light slanting through a grimy attic window. Her own whisper breaks the silence. Just old furniture and papers, she murmurs, half to herself, half to the house. But experience has taught her that personal treasures, the ones that never make it into wills or inventories, are always the most revealing. Near the far wall, hidden beneath moth-eaten quilts, inside a heavy leather trunk, her fingertips meet something unexpected. A large frame, cold to the touch, heavier than she anticipates. She pulls it free with a careful breath. It is a family portrait, sepia-toned and ornately framed, the kind of formal photograph wealthy families once displayed with quiet pride. The inscription in elegant script reads, "The Hartwell Family, Christmas, 1903. Margaret studies the image. The Hartwells' father-mother, 2 teenage sons, and 2 young daughters are posed in their drawing room, every detail captured in perfect clarity. The father stands behind his seated wife, a stern man with a proud mustache. The mother wears a high-collared lace dress, her expression serene. The children, ranging from perhaps 8 to 16, sit with the stiff dignity typical of early photography. Behind them, the parlor glows with quiet luxury, a Persian rug beneath polished shoes, ornate wallpaper curling at the corners, and almost hidden a tall mirror in an elaborate golden frame. It is at first glance a scene of peace, the kind of image meant to say, "We were here, we were happy, we belonged to this world." Margaret smiles faintly at the frozen family. Then something small but insistent draws her eyes to the mirror in the background. Its reflection seems wrong. She squints, leans closer, and finally reaches for her magnifying glass. What she sees makes her breath catch in her throat. The room reflected in the mirror is the same. The family is the same. But the scene is not. Chapter 2. The Impossible Reflection. Margaret's hands tremble as she steadies the magnifying glass. Her years of experience have trained her to examine every antique with calm precision. Yet, nothing has prepared her for this. In the reflection, the Hartwells are alive with motion, but it is a motion of terror. The father's stern pride is gone. His mouth is wide open in a frozen shout of rage. The mother's serenity has shattered, her hands raised as though to shield herself from a blow. 2 of the children cower, eyes wide with fear, while the eldest son appears to lunge forward. His face twisted with something that looks like fury, or perhaps desperation. It is not a trick of shadow or dust. The poses are different, the expressions unmistakable. 2 moments captured at once, one calm, one violent. A photograph from 1903 should not be able to do this. This is impossible, Margaret whispers to the empty attic. And she knows it is. The photographic equipment of the early 20th century could not manipulate images in this way. No digital edits, no double exposures capable of such perfect alignment. One exposure, one moment, one truth. She sets the portrait carefully on a dusty table and pulls out her phone, heart racing as she scrolls to the name of someone she trusts. Dr. Robert Ashford, historian of photography at Boston University. The signal is weak, the old house resisting the intrusion of the modern world. It takes 3 tries before his familiar voice crackles through the static. Robert, it's Margaret. She says, her voice tighter than she intends. I need your expertise on something unusual. What kind of unusual? His tone sharpens even through the poor connection. A 1903 family portrait, Margaret says, forcing the words out slowly. There's a mirror in the background. The reflection shows a completely different scene. Different expressions, different body language. It's as if she hesitates, choosing the least absurd phrase. As if the camera captured 2 moments at the same time. There's a long pause. Then Dr. Ashford speaks, careful and measured. Margaret. You know, that's not possible with the equipment of that era. Are you certain about the date? Margaret glances at the inscription again. Christmas, 1903. The Hartwell family of Salem, Massachusetts. Everything about the clothing, the furniture, the photographic paper itself, it all matches the period. Bring it to my office tomorrow morning, Ashford says at last. This sounds like something we need to see with our own eyes. Chapter 3. The Expert's Examination. Morning comes with a thin winter sun and a restless anticipation that Margaret cannot shake. She carries the portrait carefully across Boston to the basement office of Dr. Ashford. The room smells faintly of old paper and machine oil. Its shelves crowded with books on photographic history and cameras from every era. Let's see this impossible photograph, Ashford says, clearing a space on his long examination table. His silver hair catches the light as he leans forward, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses with quiet eagerness. Margaret unwraps the portrait and sets it down. Immediately, Ashford begins his meticulous work, high-powered magnifiers, angled, lighting a digital microscope, feeding live images to his computer screen. For nearly an hour, he examines every corner of the photograph in silence, his brow tightening with each new discovery. Margaret watches him closely, noting the subtle changes in his expression. Curiosity first, then confusion, and finally, something that looks very much like unease. At last, Ashford leans back, removing his glasses and polishing them with slow, deliberate movements. Margaret knows this habit well. It is what he does when words fail him. Margaret, he says quietly, in 40 years of studying historical photography, I've never seen anything like this. And there in the stillness of that cluttered basement, the portrait waited its silent reflection, holding a secret that no lens of science could yet explain. Chapter 3. The Expert's Verdict. The paper, the chemicals, the faint silvered aging of the photographic emulsion. Dr. Ashford checked each element again and again, as though repetition might somehow rewrite what his eyes refused to accept. Everything about this, he murmured, tapping a gloved finger against the glass. The paper, the chemical, finish the patterns of decay. Every sign points to an authentic 1903 photograph. He paused, his silver brows drawn tight. But the mirror reflection? He shook his head, the motion slow and deliberate. It defies every law of optics and photography I know. Margaret leaned closer, her voice hesitant. Could it be some kind of double exposure? No, Ashford said at once, the firmness of his tone slicing through the quiet hum of the equipment. Double exposures create overlapping ghosts, soft edges faint duplicates. But this shows two completely distinct scenes, not blurred, not faded, each moment sharp, crisp, and utterly separate. It's as if someone photographed two different times, and somehow, he exhaled, the sentence collapsing beneath its own impossibility, combined them. But that technology simply didn't exist in 1903. On the computer screen, the digital magnification revealed details Margaret hadn't noticed before. "Look here," Ashford said, pointing. The mother's wedding ring, see how the light catches it differently in the reflection and the shadows. They fall at opposing angles. Margaret's eyes darted across the mirrored image. And then she saw it. The tall grandfather clock in the corner. Its face gleamed in both images. But in the main photograph, the hands read 10:15. In the reflection 10:47, her stomach tightened. So, we're looking at two moments separated by more than half an hour. Ashford nodded, his voice dropping to a near whisper. It appears so. But Margaret, look at the children. She leaned forward. In the reflection, their expressions were not simply startled, not staged surprise. It was something deeper, raw fear, genuine terror captured in perfect clarity more than a century ago. Chapter 4. Searching for answers. Answers, of course, rarely wait in attics or laboratories. They hide in records in the yellowing paper of old newspapers and the careful handwriting of forgotten clerks. Determined to untangle the Hartwell mystery, Margaret spent the following days at the Salem Historical Society, where time itself seemed to linger in the scent of polished wood and crumbling parchment. Behind the long oak desk sat Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, the Society's senior librarian. Her grey hair was pinned in a perfect bun, her eyes bright with the quiet excitement of someone who has devoted her life to the past. When Margaret explained her quest, Mrs. Whitmore's expression softened into knowing intrigue. "The Hartwells," she said, drawing out the name as though tasting a memory. Yes, they were quite prominent in Salem at the turn of the century. She disappeared into the archives and returned with thick folders bound in fraying ribbon. James Hartwell owned the largest textile mill in the region, she explained, laying the folders before them. His wife, Elizabeth, was admired for her charitable work. Their 4 children, Thomas the eldest, then young, Margaret Samuel and little Catherine appeared often in society pages and charity reports. Margaret opened the first folder. Newspaper clippings, invitations to elaborate dinners, notes of donations to hospitals and orphanages. Every photograph and paragraph painted the Hartwells as pillars of the community, a family untouchable in both wealth and reputation. But Margaret's questions pressed deeper. Was there Anything unusual that happened to them around Christmas of 1903? Mrs. Whitmore hesitated, a shadow crossing her face. Actually, yes, she said at last, her voice lowering. There was a terrible tragedy on New Year's Eve of that very year. James Hartwell died in what the papers called an accident. He fell down the main staircase of the Hartwell home, broke his neck. The entire town was shocked. Margaret's breath caught. Just 1 week after the photograph had been taken. Yes, Mrs. Whitmore continued softly. It was all so sudden. Elizabeth never remarried. By spring, she had moved the children to Boston, and the house was sold to distant relatives. She glanced around the quiet archive room as though someone might be listening. But there were whispers, she added. Whispers that it might not have been an accident at all. Margaret leaned forward, heart quickening. What kind of whispers? Nothing proven, Mrs. Whitmore said carefully. But some claimed James had grown different in his final weeks. Paranoid, suspicious. Others said he had begun drinking heavily, something most unlike him. Her voice dropped further. And then there were the stories about his eldest son, Thomas. Margaret felt a chill. What about Thomas? He was 16 at the time, Mrs. Whitmore replied, her eyes narrowing. A difficult boy prone to sudden anger. There were incidents at school, nothing criminal, but troubling. After his father's death, Thomas changed completely. He became withdrawn, hardly spoke to anyone, almost as if a door had closed inside him that never opened again. Chapter 5. Family Secrets Unveiled. The next thread came from an unexpected corner of the past. While tracing property records late one evening, Margaret discovered that the original Hartwell house on Chestnut Street still stood. Even more surprising, it was now owned by James Hartwell's great-great-nephew, a man named David Hartwell. She called him the next morning, explaining her interest in the family photograph. On the other end of the line came a pause, long enough to feel deliberate, before a voice answered. You found the Christmas photograph. The man's tone carried more than surprise. It carried the weight of something darker. My family has been looking for that picture for decades. They arranged to meet the following afternoon. When Margaret arrived, she found a Victorian mansion that seemed to hold its breath against the modern world. The slate roof gleamed in the weak winter sun, and the carved wood of the porch railings bore the gentle scars of more than a century. David Hartwell, a man in his 50s with kind eyes lined by quiet worry, greeted her at the door. Please, he said, his voice low. Come inside. I have some things to show you, things that might help explain what you found. He led her down a hallway that smelled faintly of lemon oil and old plaster. And then Margaret's heart skipped as they stepped into a familiar room, the drawing room, the same room from the photograph. The ornate wallpaper, though faded with age, still clung to the walls in its intricate pattern. The carved wood mantel stood in the same position. Even the tall mirror, its gilded frame, dulled by time, waited like a silent witness. Margaret stopped at the threshold, a shiver running through her despite the warmth of the house. She had seen this room before, but only through the frozen eye of a camera taken more than a century ago. And somewhere deep in the quiet of her mind, a question stirred. If the photograph could capture two moments at once, what might the room itself remember? Chapter 6. The diary speaks. The mirror itself was gone. Only a pale, ghost-like outline remained on the wallpaper where it had once hung, an empty frame of memory that seemed almost to hum with silence. My great-great-grandmother Elizabeth kept a diary, David said quietly, crossing the room to a glass front cabinet. From within, he retrieved a small leather-bound book, its cover cracked and darkened by more than a century of handling. She never spoke publicly about what happened that Christmas, he continued, but she wrote about it. After she died in 1954, my grandfather found this diary. He believed it should stay in the family. But perhaps it was always meant to be read. Margaret's fingers trembled as she opened the book to the page David indicated. The ink had faded to a soft brown, but Elizabeth Hartwell's elegant handwriting flowed across the paper with the quiet insistence of a voice reaching through time. December 25, 1903. The photographer came today for our Christmas portrait. James insisted everything be perfect. He has been so particular about appearances of late, so obsessed with reputation. The children behaved beautifully during the sitting, though I noticed Thomas seemed restless. James positioned us all with great care, ensuring the mirror would reflect our prosperity and happiness. But as Mr. Peaton prepared his camera, something terrible happened. James began shouting at Thomas about his schoolwork, his defiance, his disrespect. The argument rose like a sudden storm. One moment we were posing peacefully. The next, James was advancing on Thomas with his hand raised. The flash powder ignited at that very instant. Margaret's breath caught. Her eyes skimmed the lines again, trying to absorb the quiet horror hidden beneath the neat script. Chapter 7. The Photographer's Secret. The diary continued, each word an echo from that long-ago winter. Mr. Peaton was mortified by what his camera had captured. 3 days later, he returned with the developed photograph. In the image, we are posed serenely as before, but the mirror behind us betrayed the truth. It revealed James striking Thomas me, reaching out in terror, the younger children cowering in fear. James flew into a rage when he saw it. He demanded Mr. Peaton destroy the plate. The photographer had already made several copies. James offered money, then threats, but Mr. Peaton refused. He said he could not destroy what might serve as evidence of. The sentence broke off in a hesitant swirl of ink. Elizabeth had not written the words, but Margaret could almost hear the ones the young mother dared not put to paper. She looked up from the diary meeting, David's steady gaze. Your great-great-grandfather was abusing his family, she whispered. David nodded, his face drawn and pale. It gets worse, he said softly. Keep reading. Margaret turned the fragile page. James drinks more heavily each night. He rages about Mr. Peaton, possessing evidence that could ruin him, destroy his business. Thomas bears bruises on his arms he tries to hide. I fear for my children, but who would believe me against James's word? He is so respected in the community. Her hands trembled as she traced the next date, December 31st, 1903. Something terrible has happened. James confronted Mr. Peaton tonight at his studio. There was a fight. Mr. Peaton lies in hospital with a broken jaw and ribs. James returned home covered in blood, claiming Mr. Peaton attacked him first. But I saw the fury in his eyes and the satisfaction. And then, as if by divine justice, James lost his footing on our staircase. The servants call it an accident, the result of drink. But Thomas was standing at the top of the stairs when it happened. Thomas, who has suffered so much at his father's hands. The entry ended abruptly, the ink fading as though the pen itself had faltered. David silently handed Margaret another document, a yellowed letter, edges frayed with age. The writing was stronger, more direct, the hand of a grown man confessing what a terrified boy once could not. "Dearest mother," the letter began, "I know you have suspected the truth about father's death all these years. I cannot take this secret to my grave. Yes, I pushed him. When he returned that night, boasting of what he had done to Mr. Peyton, threatening to do worse to all of us, something inside me broke. I was 16 and terrified. I acted to protect our family. I have lived with this burden my entire life, but I would make the same choice again." Margaret read the final line, twice feeling the weight of each deliberate word. This was no ghost story. It was a confession. Chapter 8. Legacies and Shadows. David poured 2 small glasses of brandy from a crystal decanter, the cut glass catching the late afternoon light. Perhaps it was the same decanter that had once stood in this very room on the night of James Hartwell's death. Thomas lived with that secret. His whole life, David said, handing Margaret a glass. He became a minister, dedicated himself to helping troubled children. "My grandfather said he was the gentlest man you could imagine, nothing like his father." Margaret's voice barely carried across the quiet room. "What of the photographer, Mr. Peyton? He recovered from his injuries," David said, "but the experience changed him. He moved to Boston and began specializing in legal photography, documenting evidence for court cases. He kept the Hartwell photograph until his death in 1934. It passed to his son, and then somehow it began to wander. He walked to the tall window overlooking Chestnut Street, watching the fading light gild the rooftops. The strange thing," he continued, "is that the photograph has surfaced again and again. Estate sales, antique shops, always finding its way back to someone connected to the Hartwells. As if it wanted its story to be told." Margaret felt a shiver along her spine. She thought of the attic where she'd discovered it, the way her eyes had been drawn to that heavy frame among all the other forgotten objects. "Why," she asked softly, "did your family never speak of any of this?" David's shoulders sagged with a century of inherited silence. "Different times," he said. "Domestic violence. Mental health, those were not subjects polite society discussed. Elizabeth raised her children alone, maintained her dignity, and never spoke of that Christmas again. But she kept the diary, and Thomas wrote his confession. Deep down, I think they both wanted someone someday to understand the truth." He turned from the window, meeting Margaret's eyes with a look that felt older than either of them. "That photograph," he said, "is more than a family portrait. It is evidence of a crime, a testament to a tragedy, and proof of something else. Sometimes the truth finds a way to survive even when people try to bury it." Margaret sat very still, the brandy warming her palms, but not her thoughts. She imagined all the antique photographs she had handled over the years, faces smiling children, stiff with forced patience, families frozen in their best clothes. How many of those images, she wondered, hid stories like this one? How many mirrors still whispered their own reflections, waiting for someone brave enough to look closely and listen to the moment the camera truly captured? As the evening shadows lengthened in the old Hartwell house, the unanswered question lingered like a breath on the glass. How many other truths are still waiting, silent and patient, in photographs the world believes are only pictures? "There's one more thing you need to know," David said softly, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Mr. Peaton's grandson, he's still living in Boston. And for years now, he's been quietly collecting strange photographs from the early 20th century. Photographs that hold things that shouldn't be there." Chapter 8. The Collector's Revelation. 2 days later, Margaret found herself in an old warehouse in Boston's South End. It looked ordinary on the outside, but inside was a treasure trove of silver paper mysteries. The owner of the place, Harold Peaton Thur, a man in his 80s with silver hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see through time, greeted Margaret at the door. "You found the Hartwell portrait," he asked, his gaze fixed with something like curiosity. "My grandfather would have loved to know that the photograph still existed." As she stepped inside, Margaret froze. Hundreds of photographs from the early 1900s hung across the old brick walls, each one containing a strange crack in reality, mismatched reflection scenes that seemed to belong to another time. After the Hartwell incident, Harold explained slowly, my grandfather became obsessed with what he called moments of truth, resistance. Moments of emotion so intense that they imprinted themselves on the glass and chemicals beyond all scientific explanation. He led Margaret to a special glass case where the files and photographs his grandfather had studied were kept. Before Margaret was a collection both beautiful and terrifying. A 1905 wedding photo, the bride smiling softly, but the reflection shedding tears. A 1907 Christmas photo, shadows on the wall overlapping in violent patterns. A photograph of a 1909 business meeting where a man is seen in the mirror strangling his neighbor while everyone else sits calmly there. It's all been examined, Harold said, his voice full of certainty. There was no trick, no setup. My grandfather believed that extreme emotions, fear, anger, despair can interfere with the photographic process in ways that science has yet to explain. Harold opened a thick file, the cover of which read, Hartwell Case, 1903. Inside, in addition to copies of the family portrait, were detailed records, servant testimony, medical records of James Hartwell's injuries, and correspondence between Mr. Peaton and other photographers who had experienced similar phenomena. My grandfather wasn't just investigating one case. Harold leaned in, his eyes shining. He was building a bigger picture. Look at this map. On the map of New England were countless red pins. Each pin, Harold explained, is a strange photograph taken between 1900 and 1910. Do you notice anything? Margaret stared. The red pins weren't scattered randomly. They were clustered together in strange clusters, and the one that stood out the most was Salem. Chapter 9. The Truth About Salem. Salem, Harold said softly, has long been a place where the past refuses to rest. He pointed to the dense cluster of red pins around town. My grandfather believed that some places hold stronger emotional imprints than others. Places that have seen tragedy for generations. The memory of that land cannot be buried. Margaret shuddered as she remembered Salem's bloody history, the witch trials of 1692, the accusations, the families torn apart by fear. You think that history is imprinted on the photographs? She asked softly. It's not demons or witchcraft. Harold shook his head. Think about it this way. Salem in the early 20th century still carried a legacy of fear. Families like the Hartwells, whose ancestors had been involved in the witch trials, lived in patterns of fear and control that were passed down through their blood. He showed Margaret another photograph of a Salem family in 1906. In the main photo, the parents and 3 children stood solemnly. But in the mirror behind them, a child was screaming with his mouth open. I looked up the family history, Harold whispered. The father was a descendant of a judge in the witch trials. And for generations, the family violence was repeated. Sons grew up to be cruel fathers, and then the cycle continued. Margaret suddenly understood the photographs weren't necessarily a record of the supernatural. They were a record of psychological truth, emotions too powerful to be hidden. Harold nodded. My grandfather believed that in the moments when people tried to pose calmly, what they were trying to hide found its way onto the glass. He pulled out the last photograph, a picture of the Salem Town Council in 1904, just months after James Hartwell's death. Look at these faces. Harold pointed to the main image. The leaders were solemn and formal. Now look in the mirror. In the mirror, the faces were contorted with anger. Some seemed to be arguing violently. One pointed an accusing finger at another. They all, Harold said quietly, knew that James Hartwell was abusing his family. But for money and status, they chose to remain silent. This photograph was taken just as they were discussing whether to investigate his death. The minutes of the meeting were peaceful, but the mirror told the truth. Margaret stared, feeling as if the photograph was whispering a timeless confession. This is not just a family tragedy. It is evidence of a community's complicity. Chapter 10. A Living Legacy. 3 months later, Margaret stood before a packed auditorium at the Salem Historical Society. In her hands were photographs, notes, and evidence that had traveled more than a century to reach this day. As the lights dimmed, she took a deep breath and began to tell her story. A story of a Christmas portrait, of examples of resistance and of truths that time, no matter how thick, cannot bury. Have you ever looked at an old family photograph and wondered if there was something hidden deep within it that the naked eye could not see? Perhaps like Salem. Each photograph holds whispers of the past, just waiting for a pair of eyes patient enough to listen. The Hartwell family portrait was displayed solemnly behind Margaret the Hall's golden lights, making the ancient wooden frame tremble with each breath. News of her discovery spread quickly through the research community, attracting historians, photographers, and curious citizens. Everyone wanted to see the seemingly ordinary photo for themselves, the photo that opened a maze of secrets buried for more than a century. The 1903 Hartwell family Christmas portrait, Margaret said slowly, as if afraid to break the silence, teaches us one thing. The truth always finds a way to survive, no matter how many powerful hands try to bury it. She closed her presentation with a small smile. This photo has survived more than 120 years, quietly passing from hand to hand, waiting for a patient enough gaze to recognize what it really wants to tell. In the audience, David Hartwell sat next to his teenage daughter, Sarah. After Margaret's investigation, the family decided to donate the portrait and Elizabeth's diary to the Salem Historical Society. so that Thomas's story and the pain his father had caused could be officially recognized. Thomas Hartwell lived his life carrying the burden of his father's death. Margaret continued, but more importantly, he broke a cycle of violence that had lasted for generations. He became a protector of children, dedicating his life to preventing other families from suffering as his own did. In the front row, Dr. Ashford nodded slightly, his eyes glinting with satisfaction. For him, the photo was not only historical evidence, but also a lesson that would be taught for years to come. Harold Pettin III was also present, carrying a leather briefcase filled with other strange photos, new photos that had emerged since Margaret's story was published. As the presentation ended, the crowd gathered to look at the photograph. Margaret noticed something interesting. The children were particularly fascinated. Their eyes immediately went to the mirror in the photo where the creepy story was reflected. It's like the scary part is trying to tell us something, 8-year-old Emma Richards whispered to her mother, pointing a trembling finger at Thomas's frightened face in the reflection. Margaret smiled slightly. Yes, Emma, she thought to herself. That's exactly what the photo has been doing for over a century, patiently waiting for someone brave enough to look closely enough to hear the story it's whispering. As the hall emptied, Margaret turned back to look at the portrait one last time. In the soft light, the Hartwell family seemed more alive, as if breathing with the room. Their story at last was complete. James Hartwell's fear had been revealed. Elizabeth's pain was acknowledged, and Thomas's courage was honored. The mirror kept that secret for over 100 years. But secrets, no matter how deeply buried, will find their way to the surface. Justice may come slowly, but eventually it will come. And then, like a closed circle, the story returns to its starting point. One autumn afternoon in the dusty attic of a Victorian house in Salem, Massachusetts, forgotten memories lay dormant under the dust of time. Margaret Chen, an estate appraiser, stepped lightly over the creaking wooden planks under her feet. She was taking inventory of the assets of the recently deceased Hartwell patriarch. A thin light filtered through the dusty window frames, illuminating cobwebs that swayed in the gentle breeze. It's all old stuff, she told herself, making notes on her tablet. The house had housed 3 generations of wealth, but Margaret knew it was the personal items that held the surprises. In an old leather trunk covered by frayed blankets, Margaret's fingers touched something heavy. It was a large family portrait, its frame intricately carved in wood. She lifted it gently, surprised by its weight. The sepia photograph emerged a family of 6. Father, mother, 2 teenage sons and 2 young daughters, all dressed neatly in a luxurious living room. The elegant inscription below the photograph read, "The Hartwell Family, Christmas 1903. Everything in the photograph exuded peace and order. The mustachioed father stood majestically behind his wife in a high-necked, delicately laced dress. The children held their poses as solemnly as statues. Margaret smiled slightly. This was the typical portrait of the upper class of the early 20th century. Formal, aristocratic, seemingly filled with only happiness. She was about to put the photograph down when a detail made her heart stop. Behind the family, almost hidden, was a tall mirror with a curvaceous gilded frame. Margaret squinted, then quickly pulled a magnifying glass from her pocket. In the mirror, the scene was nothing like the main photograph. Same room, same family. But everything had been horribly distorted. The father, whose face had been calm in the main photo, was now screaming, his eyes rolling back. The mother, from gentle to panic, both arms raised as if to protect. The two small children cowered, and the eldest son rushed forward, his face contorted with rage. "It can't be," Margaret whispered, her voice echoing weakly in the empty attic. In all her years of examining thousands of old photographs, she had never seen anything like this. A 1903 camera was completely incapable of combining two moments into one. There was no Photoshop, nor was there such a perfect double exposure technique. Placing the portrait down on the dusty table, Margaret quickly pulled out her phone. She needed to call her mentor, Dr. Robert Ashford, a photography historian at Boston University. And from that moment, a story that spanned more than a century began to unfold, leading each person, from Margaret David Hartwell to Harold Peaton, into the maze of truths that a mirror had patiently preserved for more than 120 years. Have you ever looked at an old family photo and wondered if there was something in it that our ordinary eyes would never notice? Perhaps like that Christmas portrait, the truth is still quietly waiting, if only someone had the courage to look deeply. The signal in the old Hartwell house was faint, as if even the air here resisted being disturbed. Margaret pressed her phone to her ear, waiting through the static until a familiar voice finally broke through. "Robert, it's Margaret," she said softly, her words trembling with urgency. "I need your expertise. I've found something unusual." A low crackle. Then Dr. Robert Ashford's calm, seasoned voice. "What kind of unusual?" Even through the weak connection, his curiosity sharpened the question. A family portrait. Salem, Christmas of 1903. The Hartwell family. The mirror in the photograph, she hesitated, searching for words that sounded less impossible. The reflection shows a completely different scene than the one in the main image. Different expressions, different gestures, as if the photographer captured two moments at once. A long silence followed, filled only by the faint hiss of the old house around her. Margaret Robert finally said, his voice lower now, "You know that's technically impossible with the equipment of 1903. Are you absolutely sure of the date?" Margaret's eyes fell again on the elegant script etched beneath the photograph. Christmas, 1903. The Hartwell family, Salem, Massachusetts. The inscription matches the clothing, the photographic process, everything, she whispered. "Bring it to my office tomorrow morning." Robert said, his tone now carrying the restrained excitement of a man who senses the edge of an extraordinary discovery. "This deserves a closer look." The next morning, Margaret carried the portrait through Boston's cold streets, cradling it as though it might break under the weight of its own mystery. Dr. Ashford's office lay hidden in the basement of Boston University's Fine Arts Building. A dim chamber, lined with shelves of antique cameras and books that smelled faintly of silver nitrate and dust. "Let's see this impossible photograph," Robert said, as he cleared a space on his examination table. His silver hair caught the glow of a desk lamp, wire-rimmed glasses already slipping down his nose. Margaret unwrapped the portrait. Robert leaned in, reaching instinctively for his tools, high-powered magnifying lenses, specialized lights, a digital microscope that hummed faintly as it warmed. For nearly an hour, he examined the image in silence. Margaret watched his face shift curiosity. At first, then confusion, and finally, a troubled kind of awe. When he finally leaned back, removing his glasses and rubbing them with a handkerchief, a habit she knew, marked deep unease, his eyes met hers. "Margaret," he said quietly, in 40 years of studying historical photography, "I've never encountered anything like this. The paper, the chemicals, the natural aging, everything screams authenticity. This is a 1903 photograph. But the mirror defies every law of optics and photography that I know." Margaret's heart quickened. Could it be a double exposure she offered, hoping for any explanation grounded in science? Robert shook his head. No. Double exposures create hazy overlaps, ghostly layers. But this shows two entirely distinct scenes perfectly clear, as if two different moments were captured and somehow fused together. But that technology simply did not exist. He brought up a magnified detail on his computer screen. "Look here," he said, pointing with a steady but tense finger. "The mother's wedding ring. Notice how it catches the light differently in the reflection than in the main image. The shadows on the wall fall at impossible angles. And this," he zoomed in further, "the grandfather clock. In the main image, it reads 10:15. In the mirror, Margaret leaned closer. 10:47, she whispered. A half hour later, Robert nodded slowly. 2 moments separated by more than 30 minutes. Preserved in a single exposure. Margaret's eyes drifted to the children in the reflection. Their faces no longer the stiff, polite masks of the main image, were twisted with unmistakable terror. "That's not surprise," Robert murmured. "That's fear, real fear." Determined to understand what the photograph had captured, Margaret traveled to Salem's Historical Society. There, among the scent of old paper and the muffled creak of wooden floors, she met Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, the Society's elderly librarian. "The Hartwells were quite prominent here," Mrs. Whitmore said, warmly, her grey hair gathered in a tidy bun. James Hartwell owned the largest textile mill in the area. His wife Elizabeth was celebrated for her charitable work. They had 4 children, Thomas the eldest, then young Margaret Samuel and little Catherine. She pulled heavy folders from the archives, their edges yellowed with time. Inside lay brittle newspaper clippings, business records, and society page photographs of smiling Hartwells attending charity balls and grand picnics. They seemed the very model of respectability, Margaret murmured, scanning the faces that now felt anything but benign. "Did anything unusual happen around Christmas of 1903? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Mrs. Whitmore's expression dimmed, the warmth in her eyes shadowed by memory. "Ah, yes. There was tragedy. New Year's Eve of that very year, just a week after the photograph was taken, James Hartwell died in what was declared an accident. A fall down the grand staircase. Broke his neck. Margaret's pulse quickened. So soon after the portrait, yes, it shocked the entire town. Elizabeth never remarried. By spring, she had moved the children to Boston. The house passed to distant relatives. The librarian lowered her voice as though the walls themselves might still be listening. There were whispers, of course. Some claimed James had grown erratic in those final weeks, paranoid, drinking heavily, which was unlike him. And then there were the stories about young Thomas. Margaret leaned forward. What kind of stories? Incidents at school. A fierce temper. After his father's death, He became withdrawn, almost silent. A boy carrying something far heavier than grief. Days later, while searching property records, Margaret made another discovery. The original Hartwell house still stood on Chestnut Street, now owned by James Hartwell's great-great-nephew, David Hartwell. When she called to explain her research, David's voice carried both surprise and a subtle quivering note of fear. You found the Christmas photograph. They agreed to meet the next afternoon. The house rose before her like a memory, unwilling to fade. A grand Victorian mansion, its ornate woodwork preserved as if time itself had been held at bay. David Hartwell, a man in his 50s with gentle eyes lined by worry, greeted her at the door. "Please," he said softly, ushering her inside. "There's something you need to see." The drawing room was unmistakable. The same wallpaper faded but still patterned with curling vines. The same carved wainscoting. Only the great mirror was gone, though its ghost remained in the faint outline on the wall where it had once hung. "My great-great-grandmother Elizabeth kept a diary," David said, unlocking a glass cabinet and retrieving a leather-bound book worn smooth by generations of hidden reading. She never spoke publicly of that Christmas, but she wrote. He handed the diary to Margaret, his fingers lingering on the cover as though reluctant to let it go. With trembling hands, Margaret opened to the marked page. Elizabeth Hartwell's handwriting swept across the yellowed paper. Elegant but urgent, as though each word had been pressed down to keep from escaping. December 25th, 1903. The photographer came today for our Christmas portrait. James insisted everything be perfect. He has grown so particular about appearances, so obsessed with reputation. The children behaved beautifully, though Thomas seemed restless. James positioned us carefully, making certain the mirror would show our family's prosperity and happiness. But as Mr. Peaton prepared his camera, something terrible happened. James began shouting at Thomas about school, his grades, his disrespect. The argument flared like a match. One moment, we were still. The next, James advanced on Thomas, hand raised. The flash powder ignited at that exact instant. Margaret's breath caught as the words trailed off the ink, blotting slightly as though Elizabeth's own hand had trembled. What had the camera captured in that blinding flash, and what truth buried for more than a century was the mirror still trying to show? Sleepy History Tales invites you to linger with these questions. What would you have seen if you stood in that parlor, watching the flash ignite? Was the photograph merely an accident of chemistry, or a moment when emotion itself imprinted on silver and glass? Sometimes the past refuses to stay quiet, and sometimes a mirror remembers more than it should. The handwriting on the fragile diary page seemed to shimmer as Margaret read the elegant script, blurring under the weight of what it revealed. It was as if the ink itself carried a century of dread. The photograph has captured more than we intended. Those were the first words. Mr. Peaton, the family photographer, had been mortified by what his camera revealed. 3 days after that seemingly peaceful sitting, he showed Elizabeth Hartwell the developed print. Imagine a holiday gathering, a quiet family moment by the hearth. Everyone posed in careful Victorian composure. And yet, behind them in the tall gilt mirror, truth had betrayed the performance. James Hartwell's arm raised, frozen mid-strike. Thomas, the eldest son, shrinking back. Elizabeth herself a blur of movement, reaching out in terror. And the younger children, their small faces twisted in fear. Have you ever seen a photograph that seemed to know more than the people within it? That single exposure captured not smiles, but violence. Something the eye might deny, but the glass could not. When James first saw the print, fury overtook him. He demanded Peyton destroy the negative. The photographer refused. James offered money, then threats. Peyton stood firm. He said quietly that he could not destroy what might serve as evidence of something. He never finished the sentence. Margaret paused, heart-pounding, and looked up at David Hartwell, the great-great-grandson of the man in the mirror. His face had gone pale. My ancestor was abusing his family, David whispered. It was not a question. The diary went on. James has been drinking more heavily since the photograph incident. He rages about Peyton having evidence that could ruin him, destroy his business. Thomas hides bruises on his arms. I fear for my children's safety. But who would believe me against James's word? He is so respected in the community. December 30th, 1903. The final entry. Something terrible has happened. James confronted Mr. Peyton tonight at his studio. There was a fight. Peyton lies in hospital with a broken jaw and ribs. James returned home covered in blood, claiming self-defense. But I saw the satisfaction in his eyes, and then perhaps, by divine justice, James lost his footing on the staircase. The servants call it an accident, the result of drink. But Thomas was standing at the top of those stairs. The ink trailed off, a century-old silence echoing in the room. David handed Margaret a second document, his hand trembling. A letter written 20 years later by Thomas himself. Dearest mother, I know you have suspected the truth of father's death. I cannot take this secret to my grave. Yes, I pushed him. When he came home boasting of what he had done to Mr. Peyton, threatening worse to us all, something inside me broke. I was 16, terrified. I acted to protect our family. I have carried this burden all my life, and yet I would choose the same again. Margaret stared at the confession, the edges of the page vibrating in her hands as if the words themselves were alive. David poured 2 small glasses of brandy from a crystal decanter, perhaps the very same that had once sat on this table when the fatal night unfolded. Thomas lived with that secret until the end, David said softly. He became a minister, dedicated his life to helping troubled children. My grandfather described him as the gentlest man he had ever known, nothing like his father. Margaret asked the question hanging in the air. What became of Mr. Peyton the photographer? He recovered, David replied. But the incident changed him. He moved to Boston, devoted himself to legal photography, documenting evidence for courts. And he kept the Hartwell photograph until his death in 1934. It passed to his son, and somehow it keeps resurfacing. David turned toward the tall window overlooking Chestnut Street. Family members have reported seeing that photograph appear at estate sales antique shops, always finding its way back to a Hartwell, as if it wants its story told. Margaret felt a slow chill crawl up her spine. Why, she wondered, had no one in this proud family ever brought the story to light? Different times, David murmured. Domestic violence, mental illness. Polite society did not speak of such things. Elizabeth raised her children alone, never mentioning that Christmas again. but she kept the diary. And Thomas wrote his confession. Perhaps they hoped that someday someone would finally understand. He met Margaret's eyes. That photograph isn't just a family portrait, it's evidence of a crime. But it's also proof of something else. Sometimes the truth refuses to stay buried. Margaret thought of all the antique photographs she had appraised over the years, smiling. Families' elegant parlors. How many of them hid stories too painful to speak? How many mirrors were telling truths no one wanted to see? David's voice dropped to a whisper. There's something more. Mr. Peaton's grandson still lives in Boston. He's been collecting images, photographs that show things they should not be able to show. 2 days later, Margaret found herself stepping into a converted warehouse in Boston's South End. The air smelled faintly of chemicals and old paper. Inside awaited the most extraordinary collection of photographs she had ever encountered. "Ah, you must be the one who found the Hartwell portrait," said Harold Peyton III, a spry man in his 80s with silver hair and eyes the color of cold steel. My grandfather would be fascinated to know it survived. Around them stretched hundreds of photographs from the early 1900s. Double images, impossible reflections, scenes that seemed to whisper more than they showed. Have you ever stood before a photograph and felt it was watching you back? My grandfather became obsessed after the Hartwell incident, Harold explained. He believed moments of extreme emotion could imprint themselves on photographic plates in ways science still can't explain. He guided Margaret to a glass case filled with carefully labeled documents. Among them, notes and negatives related to the Hartwell tragedy. After James Hartwell attacked him, my grandfather began collecting cases where cameras revealed truths the human eye missed. Margaret leaned closer to the display. A wedding portrait from 1905, the bride smiling, yet in the mirror behind her, her reflection wept. A family Christmas from 1907, shadows on the wall forming shapes of violence. A business meeting in 1909, one man's reflection reaching, almost strangling another. All authenticated, Harold said calmly. No manipulation. My grandfather developed tests to prove it. He believed fear rage, desperation could alter the chemistry of a plate, leaving behind a hidden layer of truth. From a thick folder labeled Hartwell Case 1903, Harold spread out a map of New England, marked with red pins. Each pin, he said, represents a photograph taken between 1900 and 1910 that shows similar anomalies. Do you notice anything about their locations? Margaret studied the pattern. The pins clustered like drops of blood. Many centered around one place, Salem. Salem, Harold whispered. A town where the past never truly sleeps. He spoke of the witch trials of 1692. Centuries of fear, accusation, and betrayal. Some locations, he said, hold emotional residue more strongly than others. Families like the Hartwells carried ancestral trauma generation after generation. When they posed for portraits, the camera recorded not just their faces, but the weight of that history. He showed Margaret another photograph, a Salem family portrait from 1906. Parents and children perfectly posed, yet in the parlor mirror. One child appeared to be screaming. This, Father Harold continued, was descended from a witch trial judge. Domestic violence haunted that bloodline for decades. Sons became fathers, and fathers repeated the cycle. Margaret felt the pattern clicking into place. These images aren't supernatural, she said quietly. They're psychological truths. Harold smiled sadly. Exactly. The camera becomes a witness when people try to hide their pain. He drew out one last photograph, a group portrait of Solim's town council, 1904. In the main image, stern civic leaders sat in solemn debate. But in the great council chamber mirror behind them, their reflections were anything but calm faces twisted in rage, fingers pointing in accusation. These men, Harold said, all knew of James Hartwell's abuse. They chose silence, shielding him because of his wealth and power. The official minutes describe a calm, reasoned discussion. But the mirror tells another story. Margaret stood among the photographs, the quiet hum of the old warehouse surrounding her like a heartbeat. How many other mirrors, she wondered, still hold the echoes of truths no one dared to speak? And as you drift deeper into the quiet of this night, perhaps you'll think of the photographs around you. Family portraits, wedding pictures forgotten, albums in dusty attics. What stories might be waiting there, patient and unblinking for someone brave enough to look closely? The mirror does not lie. It waits. Margaret stood before the Hartwell portrait, the dim museum lights glinting across the century-old glass. At last, she understood the weight of what they had uncovered. This was never only about one family's private tragedy. It was about an entire community's silent complicity. Neighbors, friends, church elders all choosing not to see what the mirror had been trying to reveal. 3 months later, the quiet discovery had grown into a public reckoning. Margaret stood at the podium of the Salem Historical Society. The Hartwell Christmas portrait of 1903 displayed high behind her. The auditorium was filled beyond capacity. Historians with sharpened pencils, photographers with curious eyes, locals who sensed that the past was about to speak again. The air felt charged, as if the portrait itself were aware that the story it carried would finally be spoken aloud. Margaret's voice carried gently through the hushed room. The Hartwell portrait teaches us something important, she said, her gaze lingering on the mirror within the photograph. Truth has a way of preserving itself even when powerful people try to bury it. This photograph survived more than a century, passed from hand to hand, waiting patiently for someone to look closely enough to see what it was really showing us. In the third row, David Hartwell sat with his teenage daughter, Sarah. After Margaret's investigation, the Hartwell family had chosen to donate both the photograph and Elizabeth's fragile diary to the society. Thomas's confession would no longer hide in a drawer. Elizabeth's suffering would no longer remain unspoken. Margaret continued, her voice soft but steady. Thomas Hartwell carried the burden of his father's death for the rest of his life. But perhaps more importantly, he broke a cycle of violence that had haunted his bloodline for generations. He became a protector of children, dedicating his life to keeping other families safe from the shadows that once lived in his own home. Dr. Ashford, seated in the front row, nodded with quiet approval. Already the Hartwell case had become a cornerstone of his lectures, a reminder that historical evidence does not always come in the form of official records. Sometimes it hides in a photograph, a reflection, a tremor of emotion caught on a single plate of glass. Harold Pitton III had flown in from Boston, carrying a weathered briefcase heavy with his grandfather's legacy. Inside were more photographs, images with mirrors that betrayed the careful poses of respectable families, each one whispering its own uninvited truth. The audience lingered long after the talk, drawn to the display. They stepped closer to the Hartwell portrait, tilting their heads, searching the mirror within the image. Margaret noticed something quietly remarkable. The children in the crowd moved first. Their eyes darted straight to the reflection, unerringly, finding the hidden terror. They pointed, whispered, tugged at sleeves. It's like the scary part is trying to tell us something. 8-year-old Emma Richards breathed, to her mother eyes fixed on Thomas's terrified face. Margaret smiled faintly. Yes. That was exactly what the photograph had been doing for 120 years, calling out to anyone willing to see. As the evening wound down and the crowd thinned, Margaret lingered in the empty hall. The soft museum lighting fell across the portrait, making the figures within appear almost alive. Elizabeth's quiet endurance, Thomas's haunted courage, the younger children frozen between fear and hope. For the first time in more than a century, their story felt complete. James Hartwell's reign of fear had ended long ago. Elizabeth's suffering was acknowledged. Thomas's desperate act was finally understood. The mirror patient and unyielding had kept it secret until the world was ready to listen. And now, after decades of silence, it had spoken. Margaret let her gaze rest on the faint glimmer of the reflection, wondering how many other photographs tucked away in attics, hung unnoticed on walls, might still be keeping their own quiet testimonies. Perhaps somewhere, another mirror waits, another truth waits, because secrets, no matter how carefully buried, have a way of finding their way back to the light. And sometimes justice arrives slowly, but it arrives all the same, preserved in a shard of glass in a frozen reflection, waiting for someone brave enough to finally look.